Hi, I'm Margaret Heffernan. I'm a professor of practice here at the University of Bath School of Management. I've led 5 businesses, that's the practice bit, and I write books and articles about how business works or doesn't. And I am really delighted to be kicking off the second of our Dean series with the brand new Dean of the School of Management, Steve Brammer. Steve spent the first 11 years of his academic life here, moving then on to Warwick and Birmingham and then Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia, before coming back to us here. His career is focused on those areas where business and society meet, sometimes antagonistically and sometimes beneficially. Where do the boundaries lie? Who serves whom? How far are ideas of corporate social responsibility now being replaced by much deeper, broader expectations that the whole purpose of business is to serve society? And what, on a day-to-day basis, might that mean for executives and business leaders everywhere? So, Steve, welcome. Thank you so much for opening this new series of webinars and being such a big supporter of them. I'm sure that the students and alumni are keen to get a sense of who you are, what your work is and has been about, and how you think about this rather kind of contentious area in the relationship between companies and the societies that they serve. So what I'd like to do is kind of kick off, which is right where we are in this moment with COVID-19. You've already, with remarkable haste, or speed anyway, I must say, brought out a paper about the role of business in society during the pandemic. And in it, you asked whether a business will or should return to normal. I mean, whether it should, it seems to be kind of questionable, because normal was a state of unpreparedness, which has meant that many organizations have ended up being deeply reliant on the government simply to stay alive. So I just wondered, what are your thoughts now about the state to which businesses might wish to return?
Thank you, Margaret. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for your kind introduction, and also it's great to see so many former colleagues and students' names queuing up in the attendee list. So it's great to connect with our communities and to play a role in a series that I think is a signal part of how we connect with our communities. And thank you, Margaret, for all your work on this series. You're right. We were very quick to do lots of writing around the pandemic. In fact, I think I've probably got, at the last count, 3 or 4 papers now that touch on various aspects of the pandemic, as well as work that's coming through. Definitely share the view that the pre-pandemic state was deeply problematic in a whole range of ways. I mean, absolutely, the pandemic showed that business and society was really unprepared for such a massive shock as COVID has provided. And there's absolutely a sense in my mind that we don't want to go back to a state of the world where that unpreparedness is something that we see continue for businesses or for government. Nonetheless, the changes, I think, are profound in all sorts of ways. And I think part of our gambit, if you like, or part of our interest in COVID is that COVID has been a crisis of public health. It's been economically regressive, but it's also been deeply socially regressive in a whole range of ways. If you look at the statistics on what COVID has done to gender equity, for example, I think that's deeply troubling. Women are 1.8 times as likely to be adversely affected in employment by COVID as men are. We know that there are profound impacts on the young in employment and their job fortunes, and we all know the statistics on the health impacts that show that they are disproportionately felt among the BAME communities. Our focus in thinking about COVID, though, has principally been on the way in which COVID has affected and is transforming the worlds of work and employment, and how that may play out into the future. We see a whole range of impacts and responses that are good on the one hand and bad on the other. So it's a bit like the proverbial curate's egg in a range of senses. Our concern really is to explore what we see as the potential benefits of COVID in relation to work. And we certainly advocate very strongly, although the terms I think are quite problematic, a sort of build back better. Has COVID profoundly brought to society's attention issues like inequality, issues like polarization, rather in the same sort of ways as the world wars did, in terms of providing a mirror onto society that enables society to say, you know what, the way that society works and businesses roll in it needs fundamentally to change. And do we get some sort of New Deal-esque process that comes out of COVID that leads to a better world? That's our hope, certainly, and there is much about COVID that has really shown us the best in people through social solidarity and clapping on doorsteps and recognition for key workers and all that kind of thing. But there is also, I think, something quite worrying about the way, particularly in relation to work and employment, COVID's had impacts. We know, though, that many people, and I'd include myself in that, I'm in the office today, but I'm in the office probably 3 or 4 days a week at the moment, rather than full-time as I would normally be as dean. We know that about 2/3 of the people that have had transformations of their work, where they now work more intensively remotely, would like to continue some form of that into the future. And it's going to be interesting to see, in the face of really strong calls in politics and in business for people to return to more traditional patterns of work and workplace, how that plays out. One of the things we're worried about is what we see in our work as a sort of emergence of a traditional assertion of employer prerogative. And actually, I think that is quite a potentially a missed opportunity in relation to seeing potentially progressive upsides to the transformations and the capabilities that we've all learned through a period like COVID. Fundamentally, our hope is that on the back of COVID, we see a transformation in the opportunities that the technologies provide for a more progressive form of work that leads to a better balance between work and life. We're also interested in one other thing, and that's COVID is a period of profound pivot in society in a range of ways, we think. And bear in mind, we came over from Australia in the late spring to take a role here in the university after the worst summer bushfires on record in Australia. It's interesting to us that in some ways more gradual, in some ways mostly less visible, but nonetheless creeping and aggregating and accumulating evidence on climate change is not bringing the sorts of profound government, business and civil society responses that we think we need to see there. So comparison of the massive impact and response that we see for COVID with the rather more muted responses to climate, I think, is also something that is concerning to us.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things I'm interested in terms of, because I want to come back to climate change in a minute, but in terms of the way that people have been working during the pandemic is, I've seen lots of surveys from lots of companies. Probably the largest percentage of a workforce that wants to go back to working in offices full time as before is about 20%. The smallest I've seen is 3%. And yet I'm very struck that clearly on the part of government and quite a lot of so-called leaders, the desire to get people back into the office is pretty clear. How do you think that kind of conflict is going to be resolved? Is it resolvable, or is the workforce just going to lose the little sense of freedom it just was allowed?
I think that's a terrific question, and I hope obviously that some of the progressive employers that we see that have said, you know what, there's no real reason for us to work this way. We find that substantially we work more effectively and more efficiently, and that's what our employees want of us. And we're happy to accommodate that. So in a sense, supporting employees as part of competitive strategy, I think, holds some promise for a more progressive set of outcomes. I also think that, the naked economics of it are reasonably clear. I've had a number of conversations with people who run substantial businesses, and they can tot up the capex and opex that they can avoid by more flexible ways of working. And I think the power of that, rather as it's done for in energy markets for renewable forms of energy, that has just tipped. And organizations have learned that this is effective, and I think there's no putting the genie back in the box for many organizations, I think. So I do hope there'll be some sense of a progressive way out. I think the challenge to that is really around if I'm efficient in my work as an employee and I'm remote working, then I am the principal beneficiary of that. And I think there is a desire in business to capture some of that efficiency for the business as well as for the employee. And I think there's a lot of work going on now on monitoring and control, and how one understands what one's employees are up to when one is not seeing them through the office door, and so I think that there's a whole arena of work there that I think is terrifically fascinating. But I am optimistic, particularly because of the fundamental economics of this.
Yeah, I'm not sure how thrilled people are going to be to discover that they have surveillance now in their home when they work from home. And I'm also very struck by actually what a very poor concept of efficiency it is, if really what you're measuring is inputs. If you think you're getting more bang for your buck because I take 10 hours doing something I actually could do in 2, then that's a very strange and dysfunctional work culture, it seems to me. Although most employers still think, that actually more work equals more output, even though, 140 years of productivity experiments show that that's not true. Let's go back to you raised climate change and the rather kind of muted response in Australia. We've had some reasonably optimistic news now about our capacity to hit some of the Paris Accord goals this year. Everybody has had the pleasure of seeing clean air for a little while and actually being able to hear birds sing again. Do you think that companies in particular are starting to take more seriously their obligations with regard to climate change?
I think, again, that's a terrific question, and again, I would hope so. I think I have to say the evidence is pretty mixed, and one of the challenges I think in this period that arises in general in relation to a whole range of areas one might think of as falling in with in issues of sustainability or corporate responsibility is organizational responses. Some caveats I'll come back to, generally speaking, involve organizations making changes, making investments, innovating in a range of ways. And we know that many organizations in society at the moment are on their uppers in relation to their fundamental economic responsibilities. And so I think there is a challenge to more out of the box thinking at present that comes from the fact that we're in a crisis situation and resources are scarce. And in a sense, there is a bit of reversion, I think, to thinking about the fundamentals of an organization and its success. And then I think it's easy to kick a can like climate down the road. At the same time, rather as you're suggesting, I do think there is a set of conditions, and one of the things, you doubtless have all seen these, but one of the things that I always take great heart from is graphs that show, Britain hasn't burned any coal to generate electricity since January, and I don't know what the current figure on that is, but the genuine transition in towards clean energy seems to have accelerated enormously. And much of what business has the capacity to do in relation to climate depends upon the wider infrastructures being there to produce clean energy, to make that available to us in workplaces and in organizations. So I am optimistic. I also think, rather, I live very rurally now, and I hear the bird song and the clean air and all that. And I think, again, there is an enormous demonstrative power associated with people experiencing the better thing and then saying, well, hold on a minute, that is a thing that is available to us. If we pull together and if we make it so, then actually we can have that. And you see, things like, the bringing forward of the deadline by which diesel and petrol cars will be banned for new sale and so on. I think this is all part of, an accelerating climate positive trend that I think is more encouraging than I've ever seen it, having been in this field for 20 or 30 years.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree. This question that we've been kind of talking around about how businesses take responsibility for society, in a way, has been quite a theme throughout your work. And I know you've written about the emergence of activist CEOs, as I have, seen particularly in the US, in terms of the treatment of immigrants and issues of diversity, is really where it became particularly heated in the United States. And I'm interested that you write that CEO activism is mostly reactive, and the idea that it reflects moral leadership by a corporate elite is simplistic in its falsity. The morality of CEO activism is ultimately corporate. I wonder if you could explain what you saw, what you heard, what you've read that suggests that this activism is really just corporate strategy with a slight halo on top of it.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. It was a fascinating piece of work, and you're right. And it's worth saying that the two issues we were most centrally concerned with were changes in the law in some US states to essentially ban abortion, and changes again in some US states to affect immigration. And I think that's worth bearing in mind, because I think, given the context of the United States and where the United States is up to politically and socially, they are both very polarizing issues. And so it is worth bearing in mind that, I think. In a sense, though, that's why we were interested, because what we saw was a lot of CEO activism, a lot of CEOs speaking out quite openly on those issues and advocating, by and large, what we would see as progressive agendas, progressive for women's health and progressive for embracing diversity in all sorts of senses. We were concerned really to note two things about that in my colleague Carl's flourish in writing that you quoted. Why we say this is ultimately corporate. We say that for two reasons. One is it's reactive. Relatively seldom does one see prospectively CEOs raising an emergent issue, maybe how organizations respond to intimate partner violence, for example, which is something that relatively few organizations prospectively do something about. Instead, it was a reaction to events. And in our analysis, a reaction to events that was principally not morally justified, but was framed in terms of the adverse impacts on businesses in particular regions of the United States and the challenges of doing business in particular states, principally the southern states, in light of these kinds of interventions. That speaks to us not of a proactive, progressive, forward-looking intent to give moral leadership, to say we as signal members of society advocate the following moral positions, but instead to situate that very much within a sort of commercial logic, if you like. Now, one can see all sorts of reasons why that might be the case, but it is interesting to us that that businesses are by and large relatively reluctant to put themselves out there, and that's part of why you see so many collective letters on these and other kinds of issues. There's a famous collective letter around Paris, the US pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement, and so on. Again, where organizations, rather than individuals showing moral leadership, this is about groups of organizations, one might say, pursuing, certainly articulating a moral position, but doing so in the context of if you like, a business interest. And I think that is, I think that's interesting. And my own view is, I would like there to be more business leaders that were willing to articulate clear moral positions of this kind. But of course, we all operate within organizational contexts, and one can imagine the sorts of challenges in doing that, particularly, I repeat, in the context of very polarizing issues.
Yeah. I just, it's quite interesting, I think, this idea of reactive activism, not raising issues. And it, especially because it's become terribly fashionable to talk about CEOs as leaders. But what you're really suggesting is that actually they're kind of followers. And I just wonder how far increased polarization in politics will actually let them get away with that.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And in one sense, it's an interesting one because, of course, leaders in business, leaders in organizations, leaders in politics, they face many of the same kinds of fundamental institutional constraints on what they feel they can say and what they can't say. And they're all members of the Twitter sphere, and they all get trolled, and what they say is very visible and very motivates strong reactions on both sides. And I think that's part of what we think coming out of COVID, of course, is COVID isn't just a period of crisis in public health or a crisis in economic society. I think COVID is also a crisis of public leadership, great uncertainty generates, we have discovered, generates a real complexity and real challenge when it comes to leadership, and a real reluctance to fundamentally lead, a very, very uncertain political and corporate leadership through this time, I think, which I think is disappointing in a whole range of ways.
Well, I think it's very disappointing that, having spent billions in the leadership industry, we don't seem to be surrounded by a plethora of really outstanding, clear-headed, well-communicating leaders. But I'd like just to go back to this notion of being reactive, because a few months ago, I interviewed Paul Pullman, and talking about his time at Unilever, where he had, quite without reacting to anything except that, we know about climate change, decided really to pivot the entire business of Unilever to decoupling growth from environmental degradation. It wasn't in reaction to anything. He just decided that's what the company was going to do. And he said that he thought other companies needed to do the same thing because governments are not doing what they need to do. Governments are failing on all fronts with regard to climate change and mental health and all sorts of other issues. And therefore, it was incumbent upon CEOs to start taking responsibility for this. And it struck me, that what we're seeing is a kind of emergence of what I think of as a sort of slightly hawk-dove spectrum, right? Which is the hawks are the people who cleave to Milton Friedman and say, it's only the shareholders that count, do whatever the shareholders need and want, maximize their return. And at the other end, you have Pullman saying, no, if you don't have a healthy society, business can't function. So companies have a deep vested interest in a society where the rule of law prevails, where people are healthy and where they're free, because actually that's what markets fundamentally need and crave and depend on. And I just wondered what your thoughts are about that and why, Friedman, after all these decades, still has a gravitational pull. And while everybody admires Pullman, very few are following him.
Yeah, look, I think that's a terrific question. And as someone who spent their whole career basically trying to advocate for businesses being more proactively pro-social, I think it is disappointing that so few leaders in business have been able to feel the confidence to articulate that kind of vision, and then to build an authentic organization around the marriage of a commercial purpose situated in recognizing a social and environmental purpose. Because rather, as I think Paul Polman would say, that isn't rocket, the basic proposition there isn't rocket science, right? If you're in the business of selling stuff or providing a service or whatever it is, if you can do that in a way that engages deeply with your communities, if you can do that in a way that motivates people and wins hearts and minds and doesn't, degrade the environment to an extent that removes downstream a possibility of doing that again repeatedly, consistently over time, then that's just a better way of doing business. I think what I've noticed in organization life, somewhat in corporate commercial life, but also in my time in universities, is that leadership of that quality and leadership of that vision in relation to being able to see the pathway to reconcile and navigate the emergent tensions and to lead an organization to innovate to overcome the challenges that inevitably come is just rare. Because really, I think what happens more often than organizations is a kind of free rider problem where you have the visionaries, Paul among them, a range of others in other organizations at different points in time, who find a way to articulate a vision that's compelling for their people and both their commercial and their social role. But more often than not, businesses will prioritize the commercial role, and they will see in a whole range of contexts the challenging dynamics of reconciling, an environment or a social role with a commercial purpose, and they will default to the commercial purpose. And I think that is short-termist. I mean, I was looking at, fast fashion and the demise of Arcadia and Boohoo's troubles and all, and at the heart of all of those, there are real, for me, one of the things that has always characterized my lens on sustainability and corporate responsibility is to see it as a deeply strategic, interwoven activity. I think where CSR goes wrong is where it is this kind of bolt-on, and I think that the vision of a Paul Polman is to understand the way in which that particular organization can see a future for itself that is more commercially successful and more socially relevant through that range of practices. And I think that's what's so powerful about it as an example.
Yeah. No, I agree. I mean, I think, part of his goal is that we should have no need for any notion of CSR because, if you need it, the implication is the rest of the organization is being irresponsible, and that's okay as long as we have this little brownie troop over here doing good things. And I think what's quite interesting is how sustainable that is as a model, and actually how much goodwill is it really buying anybody.
I mean, I agree with that. I mean, one of the things that's, I agree, that's the first thing to be cut when times are hard. That's where you get into issues of hypocrisy and do you really mean it and is it authentic? That's when stakeholders start saying, actually, I don't believe we're a values-oriented organization because when the chips are down, that isn't how we're behaving. And then I think that is a house of cards, as you say. So I do think that is the worst form of corporate responsibility practice.
Yeah. And I think, we're about to live through another chapter of that in the sense that, through COVID, we've seen a lot of business leaders, showing great compassion and care for the workforce. And now one suspects that they're going to go back and start thinking about all those people they were so compassionate and caring about, how many of them they can get rid of.
Yes, and how many organisations have taken multi-hundred-million-dollar and pound windfalls from government to keep their businesses going, and then are laying off tens of thousands of staff. If I was in government, I would be deeply disappointed in the way in which many in the corporate sector have, if you like, taken government money and then cut and run on their relationships with employees. I think that is a deeply troubling facet of the way that COVID's affected business, actually.
Yeah, well, there's a free rider problem if there ever was one, right?
Yeah.
I want to move on to something else that you've written about, which is you've written quite a lot about the rising incidence of mental health problems within organizations. Depression, anxiety. I mean, some of the numbers that you quote are just staggering. I think you said that 42% of US workers feel their stress levels have increased. 46% of Canadian workers say they experience psychological distress. And, certainly here in the UK, I would say over the last 3 or 4 years, there's been a real focus on mental health issues at work and what can be done about it. And it seems to me that there are kind of two issues here. The first is, why is this happening in the first place? And secondly, why has there been such stigma associated with it that for a long time we were just willfully blind to it? And in some of your most recent work, I know you said that however compassionate companies and HR leaders try to be, sufferers from mental illnesses in organizations are often still unintentionally stigmatized. How does that happen, and what do you think we can do about it?
I think so. I have two hats here in a sense. I got involved in work on mental health in workplaces in part because I saw it as a really interesting and important part of how organizations discharge their responsibilities to employees, and how you run a safe and inclusive and effective workplace from a responsibility standpoint, and partly from having been a leader in a large complex organization where inevitably people experience mental health problems, and having to be a manager and a leader in those organizations where you're actively trying to support employees through those kinds of situations. It seems to me mental health is the hidden pandemic. It's we've got a very visible pandemic out there with COVID and testing and a large scale response, but actually mental health is, if anything, more pervasive, more widely experienced, at least at the moment, and the consequences of it are genuinely profound for individuals, for workplaces, for co-workers, and for society, for our health services, and so on. So I think it is a tremendously important set of issues. The study that we ran was a study of HR managers reflecting on the ways in which, what's the origin of this, what's the role of work and working conditions and work intensification and shifting work practices and so on, but also what they saw in line managers, in other leaders, asking them to reflect more broadly on organizational practice and how it supports or doesn't support people experiencing mental health conditions. There's a massive literature on mental health, and mental health conditions are often stigmatized because they are, for those that don't experience them, very, very difficult to understand. They're disturbing, they're threatening, they are deeply worrying and discomforting. And part of what we see in organizational practice is two things that we say unintentional. We're being kind in a sense. We're saying that the stigma is unintentional because we don't think that people go out proactively to stigmatize their colleagues. I don't think that's what happens. But two kinds of things we see very, very commonly. The first kind of thing we see is a fallback on a sort of quasi-legalistic formulaic kind of thing that depersonalizes the issue, that doesn't respond to the individual, that doesn't empathize, but instead sort of manages it through a sort of manufacturing process lens, and that feels rather uncomfortable both for the line managers doing the managing and for employees, and we see that often lead to alienation in that relationship between managers and employees in a way that's really unhelpful. The surprising thing we saw, and surprising to me, I'll say that, it may not be surprising to others, was that more commonly, if anything, was a form of unintentional stigma where actually managers really wanted to be supportive. But instead of feeling comfortable enough to ask an employee what help and assistance and adjustment and support they needed, instead they sort of assumed what employees wanted. And they took this rather paternalistic kind of approach to responding to mental health in the workplace that actually had some really profoundly adverse consequences, because oftentimes really what employees wanted was to be understood, to be responded to as an individual, to feel that their voice would be respected, and that it had some agency and some control of a very challenging situation for them. So all of that, really what that study highlighted was how poorly prepared most managers in most organizations are to have the right kind of conversation with employees around mental health. And part of what we advocate on the back end of that is, again, we need to do things that are general. We need not to pick on particular groups or individuals, or to focus on people who are currently experiencing mental health problems, but instead to see the maintenance of mental health and well-being in the workplace as a much more, this is everybody's responsibility. This is something that should be continuously front of mind for organizations, and we should be doing a whole range of things that are explicit and conscious and don't single people out, but instead produce this generalized climate of understanding and engagement around mental health issues. And I know I was on with one of my personal tutees yesterday who's just shaving off his Movember mustache. I think these are profoundly important issues, and they require the breaking down of genuine discomfort in workplaces, and I think that is something that I think we can all work on, and I'd certainly include myself in that.
Yeah, it's really interesting, this thing about not asking. I think this has also come up in other issues like diversity, where all sorts of strategies are put in place before anybody's talked to the groups that are most profoundly disenfranchised and said, where's the problem? What does it feel like? What does it look like? What do you think we should do about it? They issue press releases and all sorts of motherhood statements and all sorts of initiatives without actually talking to anybody, which just exacerbates the problem, right?
Yeah, it makes people who already feel out of control even more control, and I think that is just, that feels like a real double whammy for mental health, I think.
Yeah, exactly. Now, we've had lots of good questions coming in, and the one that so far has had the most vote comes from Jacob. And Jacob says, whilst working from home could be desirable to the employee, some employers are concerned about losing, their work culture, reduction in face-to-face engagement and collaboration, and asks, how best do you think employers can maintain that sense of togetherness and collaboration, while also giving their staff greater flexibility to work at home? How do you bridge the gulf, do you think? And of course, you're having to deal with this yourself as dean, right?
Absolutely right. And I have a very long conversation. So my brother-in-law is a CEO of a tech startup, and he cannot wait to be back in the office, because he really thinks that vibe of people being there industriously bouncing off each other, doing innovative things, is really critical to his business being able to achieve what. So I genuinely, of course, in an academic environment, interactions between students and staff and creativity and collaboration across the disciplines and within the school on research is also critical. I don't think it's rocket science. I think that one thing I've discovered, and I've begun a new role during COVID. Right, it happened. I worked in the university 10 years ago, and so I knew probably 30-40% of people anyway, and some of the people I didn't know would know of me in a sense through people who did. So mine was an unusual move in a sense from that standpoint. But I've met a lot of people that I haven't met before via digital means. I've done all sorts of different ways of getting together for sci-beers with the folks in economics and all sorts of other things. So I think it's very possible. What I think it calls for, and we're giving a lot of thought to this, is more explicit structure of the working week and the working month and the working year, in order that the community understands when the rest of the community is more likely to be there. And plan for particular activities that you do in the workplace that build that sense of togetherness and culture and connection, and that provide opportunities for collision and serendipity and all those kinds of things. And you sort of plan for that. It's like almost a kind of version of a workplace version of date night, where you kind of get that structured into the working week and the working day and the working month,
right,
as well as, frankly, continuing a whole range of points of connection that I think are much more intensely happening in workplaces through COVID. I'll give you an example. When I was dean in Australia, we would try to get together as a school about 5 times a year, right? It being Australia, it would be barbecues and beer and, getting together in the open air. Since I've been dean at Bath, I've been doing 2 all-school online coffee meetings every week. The rate of connection goes from 5 times a year with the whole community to 100 times a year, prorated for the whole community. And I think that has been enormously enabling of our culture, and it just has been fascinating and fabulous to me in all sorts of ways as I've been welcomed into that community. So I agree that there is work to do to maintain those things, Jacob. They are precious about workplaces. They are precious in terms of, there are some activities you can only do effectively face to face. I mean, let's think about an effective conversation about mental health, for example. Could you do that remotely? Probably not, nowhere near as effectively. So I think there is genuinely a place for a blend, and I think organizations that get that blend right, that's a real competitive advantage, I think.
Yeah. There's another question here asking how the business school is going to change in the way that it's taught. Obviously, this event is a classic example. We're moving more towards digital. But even when the pandemic subsides, do you think digital will remain a crucial part of how the school functions?
Yeah, I do. And I think it is, we're in a process now of deeply thinking around what our curriculum encompasses, how our curriculum is delivered. In one sense, this has been the most innovative 12 months in the history of higher education. Both the schools I've run through the pandemic more or less instantaneously transform themselves from an almost entirely in-person operation to an almost entirely digitally enabled organization. And that, let's not underestimate the profundity of that shift. That is amazing work, and all to help students continue to progress with their studies and to get their qualifications and get on with their lives in workplaces and build their careers. So I think that's been amazing. I think in terms of content of the curriculum, I think there's a lot for us to think about, because an event like COVID, I think, really underscores the importance of a genuine interdisciplinary mix in what we're teaching. it's incredibly important that students coming out of finance programs can code. It's incredibly important that all of our technological capabilities, and I include my own, right? I'm no tech whiz. 12 months ago, I was a willful non-user of Teams. I used Skype and Zoom a bit to connect with colleagues around the world and see friends and family. But the functionality, I was useless on all of this stuff. And now actually, I think I can operate reasonably effectively in that medium. So there's tremendous broadening of the skills that we need students to have to operate in a much more interestingly configured organizational landscape, much more diverse ways of working, different ways of communicating, persuading, influencing, working in general. So I think there's a lot for us to think about in terms of both how we do what we do. I think we've learned a lot about what students want and what they don't want. And we've also reflected deeply on the sorts of skills that we need to give students in order that they are resilient and robust in the careers that we aspire for them to have, and of course that they aspire to have for themselves. What we're here to do is we're here to build an engaging management and business education that draws in the best of what a wonderful university like Bath can offer in order to offer students huge opportunities to increase their skills across a broad front. And I think it if anything, has reinforced my own view that the skill sets that people need in the future are necessarily plural. Saying I am a lawyer and law is all I've got is not going to cut it. Similarly, I have some competencies in HRM. The workplace and the career, and particularly the resilient career of the future, is going to require people to have a breadth of capability and skill and insight that goes way beyond that. Now, happily, we've got much of that in our curriculum already, but I think we need to be really mindful of enhancing those opportunities all we can.
Yeah. Well, I'm mindful of, the school's tagline, which is think ambitious, and what you're saying really suggests that part of that ambition has to be to move beyond the kind of classic business school curriculum and look at something that is sort of socially better attuned, much more collaborative, much more in touch with the world in which it's operating. And that, that a school of management can't be just a kind of island of isolated expertise anymore.
No, it really can't. I mean, I've never believed in that. I've always believed in breaking down those boundaries and bringing in the incredible insights that sit, behind me. I've been in this office many times with deans of the past, and now I'm occupying it for myself. Behind me, in the time since I've left, there's a brand new psychology building out there. The idea that the interfaces with psychology, with the School for Health, with engineering, with computer science, with economics, these are tremendous opportunities that our students, I think, need to have access to really enrich their capability set.
Yeah, no, I remember once talking to Robert Schiller, and he talked about when he first went to Yale, and I think sociology, psychology, and economics all inhabited the same building. And of course, then they got richer and bigger and they all split off. And he said, actually, that was the moment in which everything started to go wrong in economics, right? Because it kind of lost touch with humanity and reality and society. In fact.
Yeah, and my background, of course, was in economics. So I've made that journey personally. And I think there is some truth to that, I mean, but it is interesting to me, and I'm just reflecting on one of the comments from somebody else in the chat. We are constantly, and it's very exciting to me that we are constantly being challenged by students. So I've got some first year tutees at the moment, and one of them's a Norwegian guy, and I was on with him the other night talking about how it was going and so on and so forth. And he was saying to me, we used to teach economics. Why are we teaching this growth paradigm economics, Steve? And I think to have that level of insightful engagement with your students and to be challenged that way to not just sell the old paradigm, but to really engage with the plurality of the ways that a whole range of disciplinary thinking is emerging, I think is terrifically exciting. So I think that's we don't lack for inspiration in our communities in a whole range of ways. And I think, one of the things that's so terrific about the school is we have such wonderful students, we have such wonderful staff, and we benefit from just this most amazing or engaged, successful, and wonderfully giving alumni community.
Right. Right. We have a question here which goes back to productivity, as we discussed really when we just started, which is, the worry about surveillance to do with at home working. And the question is really, what can employers do to encourage genuine productivity as opposed to presenteeism? Are there better ways in which we should be thinking about productivity?
Yeah, look, I think so. And I do think surveillance society is quite troubling. My wife willfully shuts the door to the home office every night because she thinks that the computer might be listening to her, and is concerned about, it's a work computer and, what monitoring and surveillance is going on. I think that it is, I think it is troubling, all of that kind of stuff. At some level, I've always been a bit perplexed by conversations about productivity because I'm an outputs guy, right? Now, happily, I operate in an environment where outputs are actually relatively observable, right? Students tell us whether a class or an event or something we've put on for them is successful or not successful. We can see for our academics what amount of work they've done, what they're publishing, whether that publishing is attracting citations, what research income they're bringing in. I think we operate relative to many workplaces in an environment where it is relatively straightforward to understand the outputs of people's activities. And frankly, my own view of leadership and management is if people are getting on fine and you can see that their achievements are fine, then I don't need to know anything about the minutiae of that because I trust my colleagues as professionals to get on with it. I think there are workplaces where that productivity is less observable, and I think there are real difficulties then in trying to disentangle the work process from the outcomes. But I trust to capitalism, inventiveness, and the tech giants that there will be ways of monitoring the outcomes, not the inputs, because I think it is absolutely essential in my view that we don't, if you manage both the means and the ends, then that makes for a very oppressive and dull work environment. My own view is that is a deficiency of leadership born largely of anxiety, and that really what we have to trust is that competitive dynamics will do away with those leaders and do away with those organizations, because for every poor employer with poor practices and very poor leadership and management, there are extraordinarily visionary employers and leaders out there that genuinely want to see the best through this and to navigate to a world. Let's be honest, it's going to be very difficult in 20 or 30 years' time for there to be all the jobs we need for everybody to be employed full time. A world of work where where people work 4 days a week or 3 days a week, and there's job sharing and so on and so it has got to be a part of the future, at least for lots of professional jobs, I think. So I think these are questions that have to be dealt with. I in my own organization, I'm pretty confident I can do that. I'd be very interested to know how other organizations where perhaps the work process and the outputs are related in more complex ways, where there's more team production, for example, where one needs a more sophisticated sense of who's contributing what. I think those kinds of environments there is some complexity to, but these are problems that can be solved.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think most organizations sweat the wrong problem, right? They really sweat the 5% slacker problem, and they don't sweat at all the 95% problem, which is how do you take perfectly creative, effective people and make them more effective and more creative and happier.
Yeah.
We're so eager to weed out the slackers, and that kind of distorts the way that we think about management, about performance, and about productivity.
Oh, 100% agree, Margaret. If a tenth of the energy that was given to the tail, as it's often called in like the wrong end of the distribution was given to the top end of distribution, that would be extraordinarily effective, I think.
Yeah. So we got a question before the webinar started from one of your former students who said that he attended your classes some 20 years ago. So clearly a lifetime fan. And this is Adrianos Tessos, who says, should the managers and CEOs of companies that emerge as clean winners from this health emergency do more to help society than the managers of businesses that are just fighting to stay busy? So in other words, are the good guys going to end up carrying more of the burden?
Yeah, I think there is always a burden of success in life for individuals and for organisations. I think that is a sort of golden rule at one level. I think my own view is that it is I say this for myself. I think it's a privilege to be in a position to offer that kind of benefit to society, and if we can, in our organizational roles, in our individual lives, play that kind of leadership role where we can make a difference through our own practice, individual or in the context of our organizations, then I think that is something that is always worth doing. And I see that as in a sense, from a positive standpoint of being in a position to make a difference and choosing to do so, rather than the negative standpoint of almost being punished for being one of the good guys. I think that it's an extraordinary privilege in organizational life and as an individual who is extraordinarily privileged. I remind myself most days to be able to play that kind of role, I think.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And we had a question, which I think segues into this nicely, which is from Janet Ferniho, which is, are there companies that you particularly admire that you think are managing things well at the moment? And if so, what is it that they're doing to earn your attention and admiration?
Yeah, I was just trying to think about whether to name them or not, but I think there are.
Guys, right?
Yeah. I think there are plenty of organisations, for example, that are not laying off large numbers of staff, that are saying, can we take this opportunity to pivot? Can we take this opportunity to think about how we work smarter, not harder? Can we do things that are enhancing of all of our lives as well as of organisational effectiveness? I have to say, as someone who's transitioned across countries, a lot of British retail has had a lot of criticism from me over the last 6 months in my household, as it's taken me 3 months to get a bed or 4 months to get a table or whatever it is. I think there is a, without being too strong on it, I think this is a period where organizations that have been hanging on a bit, that were never particularly effective or haven't for a long time been effective organizations, get weeded from the organizational gene pool. And I think there is a reckoning there that is, in one sense, a good thing, because it will mean space then in the ecosystem for new organizations to flourish that maybe can do things differently. So I think there are many organizations doing a really good job, particularly on the employee front. I think there's many people who have some of the work that's been, if I think about the university, some of the extraordinary work done to support students through an incredibly testing time, where they have been locked away and they've been shielding or furloughed, or they've lost all their part-time work opportunities, and just an extraordinary difficult time. And it has been, I think, a sense of, there has been a sense of society, at least for most of this lockdown period and most of the pandemic, genuinely trying to act in concert in the common good. And I think that has been greatly encouraging. It really has. And you see that in lots of businesses too. I think it's been very, very the levels of change made to try and keep staff safe, to try and keep customers safe, has just been extraordinary.
So we're nearly out of time, so I'm just going to ask you one very quick question. As we get vaccines, as lockdowns subside, as we return more to a university life of the kind that we've known before, what is the thing you're most looking forward to?
We have an enormous amount to look forward to. I won't harp on about the new building, but that's going to be great to have us all in one building together, and it is a tremendous space designed to welcome our various stakeholders together into one place. I think as I reflect on the school having rejoined it, I think we've always had amazing staff. We are blessed by having incredible students, and they go on and they become hugely successful alumni who, thankfully, many want to remain connected and interested in their school, and we're enormously grateful for that, because that enables us to pay lots of things that were characteristic of their student experience forward into the next generation. If I think of what's the job of work here, I think the job of work is in communicating the incredibly precious, wonderful thing we have here in the school and in the university much more broadly across both local, regional, national, international stakeholders. I don't think we have been particularly effective at telling our story about just all the things that go on here that are incredible. And I think an ability to get out to our international communities, to get out really among our alumni, to connect globally, to take that message to the world is something that I'm really looking forward to. I think that's what we really need. I think on our next stage of our journey, we need to get out there and be more confident and consistent and compelling in getting that message out there.
Thank you so much, Steve. Well, apparently we've been too productive. We were supposed to finish at 1:45, and here it is at 2:00. So it just goes to show if you've got a good conversation going, it's worth hanging on. Steve, thank you so much. Good luck in for all the things, the changes that are coming your way. Thank you for making time to talk to us, to students, to alumni, to the whole community that cares about and is interested in what's happening at the School of Management. We will be doing future webinars, one a month from now till the summer. So please pay attention to email notices and Twitter announcements about what they will be and when they will be. Thank you for joining. I'm sorry we couldn't get all of the questions in, but thank you for sending them. And thank you and goodbye.
Thanks a lot.